What we are fighting for right now is each other. And that's it. Because as Wen says, it's not about winning the climate fight, or stopping climate change. We may not even be at a point where we can do that, but what we can save is our collective humanity. In my hometown, where, another beautiful thing that happened, of course, is the election of Zoran Mamdani, right? 34-year-old Muslim brothers. He's celebrating Ramadan right now while going through a massive snowstorm. And he said, you will have to get through all of us. New York City, a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, and as of tonight, a city run by an immigrant.
Welcome to the Pioneers of Possibility podcast. I'm your host, Kareem Afzal, and today I'm really thrilled to have my longtime friend, Anthony Rogers-Wright of the Black Alliance for Peace. Welcome to the show, Anthony.
Oh, salam alaikum, brother. Ramadan Kareem. It's so good to be with you.
Anthony, really wonderful to have you. We'd like to dive into your background a little bit, where you grew up, where you were born, your parents, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I am blessed to be the son of two Sierra Leonean immigrants, Marianne Rogers-Wright and Dr. Muhammad Samura. I was born in D.C., but I like to joke around and say that my life began when we moved to New York City when I was around 6.5, years old. New York City shapes me to this day, not just because of sports teams and division rivals of yours, but just the culture of New York. Being able to grow up with people like you, as well as white people, as well as, Puerto Rican people were a big part of New York City, and all of that having so much influence, I think, in my politics today, the work that I do today, the food that I eat, although I'm in the Midwest now, so finding a good slice of pizza is not as easy as it was in New York. Certainly, I don't even want to talk to you about what they call cheesesteaks out here. To be like lawsuits from the city of Philadelphia. But was blessed to have a single mother professor who was able to allow me to go to the George School, where I, Hashem and Allah put you and I together, and got to meet people like you and get an incredible education. I was just recalling before our discussion, my Middle Eastern history teacher, John Davidson, and how great that class was, and how it opened my mind. All of our incredible science teachers, Ali and Pacho and Mac, Ed Utes, this guy was basically a university professor at the high school level, a very tough physics teacher. And I found out the hard way of messing with Ed Utes, trust me. And then, of course, being able to be influenced by incredible Black educators, including Pippa Porter Rex. Pippa, who I'm still in touch with, the English teacher who introduced me to Zora Neale Hurston and Audre Lorde and people like that. And of course, the great late Nate McKee. And I will never forget my football coach, the great John Gleese, who had this incredible ability of making 5'0" people like me feel like I was 6 feet tall. I got to play with our dear brother Ibrahim Fletcher, who also is still, in the football coaching game, because of these experiences that we had at the George School.
And you were a great trash talker.
Yeah.
I was skinny little guy. On the sideline, like I was a horrendous, like 120 pounds soaking wet. But you were the running back, right? So you would run through the line, people would tackle you. You're like, you can't touch me, and you would slap in the ground, and making sure that the other team understood.
Matthew Crocker, by another great coach and educator, Tom English, was charged with literally coming and finding me after every play and dragging me back to the huddle. I remember that fondly. Matt Crocker, like, come on, Khalif, let's get out of here. And then, off to university, where I studied. I double majored in environmental science and policy and jazz composition. Well, the jazz composition kept me sane, but there was no way that my professor mother was going to pay for me to get a degree in music. So it's solely. So that was understood. And then
are you playing today?
I
Were you
am
playing
still
jazz
playing
today?
today.
You still playing?
It was bass guitar and stand-up bass that helped me pay for grad school. I lost my mother like my first semester of grad school, and of course that had some financial implications. But in the summers, I got to go to Europe and all across the country playing music, and that helped to supplement my ability to be able to go to grad school. And then since then, I've been doing a combination of what we call people-centered human rights work in the larger lens of climate change and the climate crisis, really specifically focusing on what some people refer to as frontline communities. Those communities, like in Chester, PA, they tend to be Black, Brown, and Indigenous and poor, who are being disproportionately exposed to pollution. The incinerator in Chester, for instance, mountaintop coal removal in Appalachia, and then, of course, just the execrable human rights conditions in the Gulf South of the United States, which is where the fossil fuel industry and petrochemical industry have basically turned into a economic and energy sacrifice zone, right? Specifically, there's a community known as Cancer Alley, for goodness sake, because of the amount of cancer incidents in this majority Black community, and all around the world as well. As you know, I have had the blessings of traveling to Palestine 3 or 4 times, as well as other conflict zones in Ecuador. I get to work indirectly with the Colombian government, now. So I have had a very, very, very blessed life. I have a son who's turning 11 this year. My God, Zaire, who, if you want to talk about trash talking. Like,
This is what they do.
this kid, I sometimes tell him I should have named him Karma, because I can hear my mother from beyond, like, saying, like, I'm so happy my grandson is like this. And we're just about to bring another life. We don't know the gender yet. We want to be surprised in May. So
That's
yeah,
great.
that's sort of
Congratulations.
like the 5 cent tour.
So the two areas I really want to talk about: climate justice and justice as a whole, right? So
Mm,
we're in the midst of a climate crisis. Who have spent much of your career and much of your life working with people on climate solutions, climate justice, pointing out the wrongs that are done. You talked
mm.
about the American South, but talk to me a little bit about focusing on local solutions for, there's not a silver bullet for somebody in Colombia versus somebody in sub-Saharan Africa, for
That's
example.
right. That's right.
And talk to me about how you walk people through uh, supporting them on their climate journey.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head with, there's not a one size fits all approach, except for the fact that we know we have to rapidly transition from the way that we produce and transmit energy, right? So I'm not going to go to a developing or global South nation and tell them you have to stop using fossil fuels, at all costs. Like that's the only thing that you can do, because that would just be rude and extremely inappropriate. We have to, of course, tailor our climate approach and climate solutions to the given location of where people are. This reminds me of one of my favorite Pan-Africanists of all time, the great Amilcar Cabral, who said, no matter how attractive the machinations of one geography may be to you, you can't just bring that into another geography, sprinkle it in, and stir. You have to have a firm understanding of the material conditions, the historic conditions of the area that you're in. And that might even be different depending in one country, right? Look at our country. California is different than Pennsylvania, slightly different than New York, and as you noted, slightly different than the Gulf South. So it really, really starts with, I know it sounds cliche, but meeting people where they are. Even with our justice work, we have seen many nonprofits or foundations, maybe like the Gates Foundation or the Bezos Foundation, having a very paternalistic and even colonialist approach when they're going into these nations, forcing them almost to do a certain thing as a condition of receiving resources. And this does nothing but, replicate the colonial relationships that many Western nations have had with, be them in the Middle East, nations of the Caribbean, South America, and certainly Africa, have had for over 500 years. So we certainly can't, do that. But what we do know is that we have to reduce, if not eliminate altogether, emissions. There's, things like hydrogen, production, which is taking off. Even to some extent, the hard conversations on nuclear, which of course is zero emitting, but we also have to weigh that with, one thing that we always ask ourselves is what else will this impact? So even a massive transition to renewable energy, wind and solar, still requires the extraction of a lot of critical minerals. And it's indigenous people who happen to live by, where all these critical minerals are in the United States. We know the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so this all has to be weighed as well. I mean, one thing I do remember, Ed Utes, the physics teacher, saying is that, energy is messy. There are elements of entropy and thermodynamics that have to be considered. So it also, Kareem, is a function of efficiency. We can't just say, let's produce more energy and continue living the way that we live, very, very profligate lives. You and I, with all the challenges that we have in this country, are so blessed, as are our children, to have citizenship in this country, because there are certain things that even in the poorest parts of this country that are afforded to us that are not afforded to people who say live in the global south. And this all has to be considered as well. It's not just about transitioning the way we produce and transmit energy, but there are cultural shifts that we have to embark on how we use energy, our relationship to energy, our relationship to land, water, to each other. And certainly when I go to and have the blessing of visiting other nations, I don't say, this is how we're doing it in America. That would probably end the conversation before it even started. So there's a lot of, it really starts with the human connection, first and foremost, learning about, the culture, learning about the specific situations so that we do things that are feasible and that are appropriate to that geography, rather than being paternalistic and telling them, this is what you're going to do, this is what you have to do. Because again, the idea of just replacing a fossil fuel empire with a renewable energy empire is just really a vicious circle that we don't want to replicate.
I recently read a book called Frostbite. And basically Frostbite, Nicola Twilley, it's a British writer, but she studied the evolution of cooling food, right? So we got to sort of our current food ecosystem basically through iterations of refrigeration, right? Mm-hmm. So keeping food cold, bringing it from faraway places to somebody's dinner plate by keeping it cold. That's evolved over time. The last part of that is, we say the global south. So plus or minus 10 degrees, I say, from the equator, right, is where a huge amount of smallholder farmers farm their land, right? Smaller than smallholder farmers, defined as under 5 acres. And I think the statistic was 70% of their crops spoil before they get to market. It's loss of income, of that 5 acres, only 2 of those acres are really getting to market, which is contributing to what? Methane. But plopping a refrigerator, for example, a refrigerator truck, brings its own challenges, right? Because these are people who are disconnected from the grid. They have unreliable power. They live in mountainous areas. They can only afford a bicycle as opposed to a refrigerated truck. So how what's the solution, right? There's nothing prescriptive. Get them a refrigerated room, but they don't have connection to power.
Right.
And there's training resources to do the maintenance on that thing, and there's a whole ecosystem that goes into supplying that. We need to provide local solutions, and I think there are smart people working on that problem, but they're working on that problem from a lens of technology that sort of the developed, I don't like to say it this way, but the developed world, or the industrialized world, not developed, it's not the right word. Industrialized world, right. Has access to and has the funding and resources to, and it just doesn't work for them. I think this second point is India has been able to get to close to 50% renewable energy in an incredibly short amount of time. Yes. So it's kind of the marriage of good policy, but localization that created jobs, that create these solar panels, and taking advantage of the natural resources of like lots of irradiation from the sun in order to bring up this to, almost 50% of
Yes,
renewable energy.
which is to say nothing about the People's Republic of China.
Yes,
And I believe you have been. I mean, everyone I speak to,
52 times,
yeah, right,
more
everyone who I
times than I.
speak to says like, "Have you ever seen the Jetsons?" Right? Like that's that's what it's like being in Beijing and Shanghai, and we of course
Chongqing. So Chongqing is the city where the trains are going through the middle of the
yeah,
skyscraper,
yeah,
right? So now there's flip side, right? So the sort of the government can do that
right,
from sort of decree.
right,
They can plant 1 billion trees.
right,
They can install 1 million toilets, so the people have proper sanitation. They could say you get a free license plate instead of going into the auction if you get an EV. And what
right.
does that do? It creates consumer behavior that
Yes,
everybody wants an EV because they don't have to sit in the license plate auction and pay $15,000 to $25,000 in Shanghai. And all of a sudden, in 5 years, they have, half of the new cars sold are EVs.
exactly.
And pollution is better. It's not great, but
It's not great, but I mean, by some
you can see the
estimates,
curve has
the
bent.
curve, they have reached peak emissions and it will be going down, and so it's like you say. I mean, I think that everyone I've spoken to who's visited the PRC believes that the government is actually invested in people, in the well-being, of people, and of course the technological advancements that they've been able to make. When you're investing in people's education, when you're investing in their ability to stay healthy, proactively, you see people exercising. I mean, even in less developed nations like Colombia, where I've been many times, you just see our elders outside exercising, and it's about this understanding of healthy people are going to be in the best position to develop healthy solutions. And there's a ways to go, of course, but yeah, $10,000 electric vehicles, but also the option, because something that I love that the president of Colombia likes to say, Gustavo Petro, is, transit justice is less about getting poor people in electric vehicles and more about getting wealthy people into more public transportation. And I think that when you have, I mean, we live in or close to cities where there has been robust public transit. I didn't have my license, I don't think, until I was 21 or 22, growing up in New York City. And this really does, make a difference as well, because as I said earlier, it's not, just governmental shifts that have to happen. Cultural shifts, our relationship with our planet as individuals and as collectives also has to be considered.
You talk about Colombia, right? So Colombia and public transportation. Colombia has, I think, one of the biggest bus networks
Yes,
in Bogota, right?
yes,
I think it's near the top from a major metropolitan city around the world in terms of bus usage.
yep, yep.
Um,
It's incredible. I mean, Gustavo Petro was the mayor of Bogota before becoming president, and this was, amongst his largest accomplishments. And now really working on getting as many of those buses being electric vehicles, as possible, because of course, diesel, is not the best way, and he is no fan of fossil fuels, so he doesn't even like using gas for buses, because methane is actually 80 times more heat
it's the
trapping in the
worst,
short term. It's worse.
worse than CO2 or
Right,
carbon,
it's
right?
CO2. Exactly. So, I mean, I think that it's very incredible. I always like to say, yes, they are developing nations in that they are developing solutions faster than, in many cases, we are in the United States, and in some cases, in Western Europe.
You talked about minerals, right? So we need to transition to EVs, but at the same time, it's a different type of fossil fuel, right? So it's not necessarily burning, but we need it in the cell packs, or we need it in the small modular reactors for nuclear power, because we could solve a lot of the world's problems by permitting
Yeah.
properly with nuclear energy, but huge amount of that material is in conflict-ridden zones, where people are fighting for access to who has the rights,
Yep.
for the stuff under the ground. I mean, how do we get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, call me socialist, and many do. um, Commodifying energy is a massive mistake, and I'm not saying this to put people out of jobs or anything like that. We use phrases like just transition, right? The transition is inevitable, but it's not inevitably just. And the commodification of energy makes energy even more complicated than it already is. Now, speaking of the People's Republic of China, we don't know if it's true, but they're getting closer and closer to fusion. Where your daughter just graduated from, I have a dear friend, Michael Zucker, who is like a genius. The previous National Renewable Energy Lab, or the
Whatever it's called now.
right now, I mean,
The
Michael
great
was
big
telling
lab
me
of the West.
exactly was that he's like, the reason why we're not pushing fusion more is because there's no way to make money off of it, right? He basically told me you could get like a fusion reactor about the size of a football field, buried about 10 feet underground, and you're powering Denver for like 500 years. There's no way to make money off of that. He was like, we pretty much have had it in the United States, but he mentioned that it's probably in the same warehouse as the Ark of the Covenant from Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Just like
For the aliens.
put it back there, and so that's the other question that we have to ask ourselves. Investor owned utilities, Boulder being one of the places where they don't want to be investor owned anymore. They want to be 100% public power. And when Governor Jared Polis, who was then the congressman that represented Boulder, he was pushing for that big time. And I think that when we decommodify the generation of energy, that can go a very, very long way. And as you said, maybe there won't be these conflict zones anymore. We have to think of the ability to keep lights on, heat and cool homes, to be able to plug in medical equipment for especially our elders and maybe younger people, as a human right, as a people-centered human right. But we know that the history of energy production is a history of conflict, is a history of colonization. A Shah doesn't get installed in the Islamic Republic of Iran if it wasn't for basically British and Western governments not wanting control over, their great resource of oil. And then, of course, we know that this is the impetus for basically slicing up the Middle East and breaking up the Hashemite kingdom into, different territories that were favorable to allowing access to this. So it was conflict from the beginning. The Rockefellers here in the United States, conflict from the beginning in terms of what that meant for indigenous people who were displaced, if not right, flat out killed, and basically exterminated to get them out of the way. Right. This is what's something that Raoul Peck talks about in his 4-part series, Exterminate All the Brutes. Was that like it was energy extraction, it was resource extraction. So I think that when we understand better the colonial history that goes with the extraction of resources, Marx, I don't want to scare your listeners too much, Marx referred to this as the core and the periphery, right? The periphery is where all the resources were. The core were the empires of Europe and now the United States of America. And as long as we think of dollar signs instead of services when we're thinking about energy, even if we shift to 100% renewables, there is still going to be that element of conflict. And so, it turns out that public services and public control, democratic, some of us in the environmental world like to use the phrase energy democracy, really democratizing how we produce and distribute energy, because we know that if we have to hear from our indigenous siblings, if we have to hear from developing nation siblings on what it would mean to extract a lot from them, that would hopefully change our attitudes a lot more than just a corporation going in and saying we're going to do whatever we want in the name of unlimited profit and unlimited economic growth. There's a saying which is anyone who thinks that you can have unlimited growth on a planet with limited resources is either a madman or an economist. So that's something to think about as well.
I have traveled the world and talked about clean mobility and hydrogen energy and many of these different things, that when we think, if you think of a kilogram, 2.2 pounds worth of hydrogen to make that from water, if it comes from clean renewables, and if you can make it at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, where depending on where you are in the country, that's usually impossible,
Right.
right? Because of regulation, because states or governments around the world are regulating power price, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, but when you, if you were to have a democratization of energy, for example, and you could truly take it a cheap renewable when the air conditioners aren't running, the sun is shining, and you have nowhere to use it, you could make hydrogen at say 2 cents a kilowatt hour, or even when you're curtailing power, but you can never actually get it at that, right? So,
Right.
but then you could be completely competitive against diesel tomorrow, right?
Exactly.
So when you could make the hydrogen at say 2 cents a kilowatt hour ish, roughly, then you could have a fuel that's clean burning.
Right.
If it's in a fuel cell or burning in an internal combustion engine, you could do that. But I have had governments, think tanks, philosophers on energy. They all tell me if you could build your own microgrid that's disconnected from the grid, kind of a democratization of energy, if you will. It's just in Japan, TEPCO, right? So
Yeah.
you're not pulling from someone like that, which it's 18 to 22 cents a kilowatt hour, then you could solve a lot of the world's problems.
Yeah.
But I think the issue is everywhere in the world is the same, right?
That's right.
So in the end, governments are regulating power price, and we're not. I'm not saying that's the entire problem, but that's part of the problem in bringing solutions
Absolutely.
to the masses. You were just at COP. Is there anything out of there that gives you hope? I mean, I am a hopeful, positive thinking person,
Yeah.
right? Or is there a lot of despair? Where are you on the
Yeah.
spectrum?
Yeah. Well, no,
Tell
I've
me
always
something
loved
that
that
gives you
about
hope,
you.
something that gives you despair.
Yeah, you have always been the holder of our high school's motto of "Mind the Lights," and you mind it very well, and it is among the many reasons why we cherish you so much. Well, yeah, let's start with what gives me despair. I think that the Black Alliance for Peace, following the Conference of Parties, is what COP stands for. It's the annual global climate summit, and this year it was in Brazil. And this was sort of like the first year since Glasgow, Scotland, where it wasn't held in a major fossil fuel producing country, right? We had Egypt, Sharm el Sheikh, then we had Dubai, and then we had the Doha, even, right? And then we had the Azerbaijan, right? Baku. And these are, of course, nations that the primary source of income is fossil fuel production and distribution. So we went in with lots of high hopes. Brazil also is a nation with the most Afro-descendant people in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, a very, very critical indigenous population. It is the home of what many people refer to as the lungs of the planet, the Amazon rainforest. And it had just a country that had just sort of dispatched of a less than, if we will, democratic thinking president of Bolsonaro, and in comes Lula, who basically said, "I'm coming back to try to bring some order and sanity to my country." And so we went in with very, very high hopes. The first day, it was clear that indigenous people and Afro-descendant people weren't being centered. So on the first day, indigenous people stormed, the conference, got through just to say, make their presence known. It was extremely valiant and very, very inspirational. At the end of the day, though, Kareem, just a lot of talk, the same thing coming out of it. We're going to get to this. We're going to get to the just transition. We're going to get to climate finance, of how we're going to finance this transition from fossil fuels. But still, it's a global climate conference, and it was still littered with fossil fuel executives, like 1,000 of them, which is, they had more representation per capita than most developing nations, who, of course, this was a very, very expensive COP to get to, because Belém is not a very, very big city. So accommodations, I mean, at one point, like some people were seeing prices of $15,000 a night for a
15,000 a
room.
night.
Right? I mean, it was out there. So that not so good. What was hopeful though was this is one of the first years since Glasgow where we were able to have an alternative space that was called the People's Summit. And the declaration that came out of the People's Summit is something more of what we're looking for. This was a very internationalist approach. The first paragraph of the People's Summit Declaration included solidarity with Palestine, included solidarity with Venezuela, who was experiencing boats just being blown up by the U.S. military, and making all of these connections between militarism and ecocide and genocide and lack of respect for women and indigenous sovereignty as all being part of the climate discussion, and therefore needing to be a part of climate solutions. And it was a very, very beautiful process. I got to speak to you at some point in our first discussion from there, right along, the Amazon River, the mighty Amazon River. It was incredible, seeing all, and this is what world solutions are going to have to look like rather than being exclusionary, right? Like we know, for instance, delegates from the Islamic Republic of Iran were not allowed in the so-called blue zone, yet were not for the Islamic Republic of Iran, the issue of ecocide would not have even been in Belém. And so the People's Summit afforded us the opportunity to speak with these amazing people who brought that issue, which was, and when they brought that issue and they were putting it in the perspective of Palestine primarily, but indigenous people were like, oh, we get that too. Afro-descendants we get that as well. And so that makes me very, very hopeful. And as a matter of fact, as a result of that, in large part, I'll be heading back to Colombia for the first ever fossil fuel phase out treaty conference being held in Santa Marta, being put on by the Colombian and Dutch governments, where we will continue the process of that People's Summit as informing the alternative systems. Because whether it's stopping, genocides in the Middle East or the African continent, whether it's stopping the proliferation of militarism and more militarized weapons, we are very, very concerned right now with the agency of the United Nations, with the effectiveness of the United Nations. We have a body that just approved a so-called board of peace of people who aren't even from Gaza, like that are going to be making decisions. And this is supposed to be an agency that first and foremost upholds international law and international human rights law. And because we have lost confidence in that process, we're really that's what came out of Belém, the People's Summit, and we're going to continue that as we set our sights on Turkey, which is where the next COP will be, and then after Turkey and Ethiopia, where the COP after that will be. There will always be this People's Summit presence there to hold government accountable and to send the message: we're not going to wait for you. If you're not going to do it, we will find sort of bilateral treaties that nation states can make with each other to and if our country won't do it, you've got a pretty kick-ass district attorney in Philadelphia, one of my favorites, and Larry Krasner, working at the city and working at the local level. There is a climate conference of mayors, about 300 of them in the United States, and it's bipartisan, right? A lot of people don't realize that the first city in the United States of America to go 100% renewable is Georgetown, Texas, which was presided over by a Republican mayor. Him and Bernie Sanders became very, very good friends, and they still to this day speak regularly. So that makes me very, very hopeful of people saying, why are we waiting? Why are we giving so much credence to a Paris Agreement that was not the answer at scale that we needed, especially now that we've blown through one of the Paris goals of 1.5 degrees Celsius in warming. That's gone, so we
That's
have
very
to
gone.
That's gone.
Yeah.
We have to change the way that we think and who we depend on. It reminds me of something what came out of the People's Summit. A dear brother and author, Wen Stevenson, who wrote a book called "What We Are Fighting For Right Now Is Each Other," and that's it. Because as Wen says, it's not about winning the climate fight, or stopping climate change. We may not even be at a point where we can do that, but what we can save is our collective humanity. And if we can save our collective humanity, there are a lot of things that we can build off of, especially when we know that the climate crisis will get more intense. If we do not save humanity, there are things we may be willing to do to each other for scarce resources, including water, by the way. And as my professor and mentor in grad school, the great Helena Brown, said, if you think wars over oil are bad, wait till you see wars over water. We don't want to get there. We don't want to get there.
We could find ways to exist with less oil, but we can't live without water, right? No. So you can't grow your food, you can't grow your crops. You can't do anything without water, and that is absolutely true. And we could have a completely different podcast about water usage, land usage. Bigger the land, the more water consumption, AI data centers, and the water usage required in order to cool sort of the heat produced. And I was curious. I asked a good friend who works in AI, what are the CO2 emissions if you ask ChatGPT to turn Anthony Rogers-Wright into a superhero, right? Or these caricatures that people are doing. Like, what is... Because that's a lot of computing power that is pooling from all of these pictures and all of anything that's about you on the internet.
Points.
And nobody's been able to sort of pinpoint that for me, but I think it's an interesting reference point when we think about sort of the future of energy, what AI can do and what it should do and not do. And sort of the consequences of those things, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, the explosion of creative opportunities for people in using this tool are enormous.
Yes.
But what is the byproduct
in,
carbon emissions, energy consumption, and where could that energy consumption have gone? In supporting people in disparate parts of the world.
Right. But also, brother, when we're talking about AI and we're talking about data centers, also the impacts on the value of human life, right? Like, for instance, and human labor. For instance, this EPA, the president's current EPA, has said that the value of our lives is $0. Okay.
They've reset the value of a life. What was it? 2 point something million?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Previously, but now $0. $0
in total economics. So the value of human life, for listeners, I think was defined as birth to grave, the amount of economic impact that person would have had, earnings, investment into the economy, buying stuff, all the thing that goes into them creating a life, passing it on to progeny if they have any, and to death. But it has been now reset to
$0.
Right.
Zero. I want to put that in perspective, Kareem.
We are worthless.
That is less. I was worth more money when I was a slave, than I am now, according to EPA. So that's one. But the irony being that some of the biggest proponents of this program known as universal basic income, right, where essentially every month the government will give you money to do whatever. The biggest proponents are Sam Altman, Elon Musk, and other big tech heads. And my theory is this isn't some benevolent thing, right? They weren't, this isn't zakat, right? This isn't tzedakah or charity.
Compulsory right? Charity for our listeners.
This is an understanding that if we have a surplus population whose labor is not necessary anymore.
It's now worthless.
They're now worthless. And by some accounts, by 2030, that'll be about 2.5 billion people worldwide and if they don't have an ability to be compensated, there's going to be a violent uprising. They understand this. I mean, billionaires are not stupid. They also understand they are greatly outnumbered, and they know history. I mean, even in this country, it took a New Deal to quell very, very, very aggressive labor that at that time was heavily informed and influenced by communism and socialism. The New Deal basically calmed everyone down and said, hey, the government is going to provide certain services that are, I mean, not everybody, right? You and I and your daughter and, my aunties were all left out of the New Deal, but that's a whole nother story for another time. So this also goes back to the work of climate change is human work first and foremost, people-centered human rights, first and foremost, which is why the People Summit understood that. It's like we can't talk about climate justice if there's an ongoing genocide in Palestine and illegal occupation. We can't talk about climate justice with everything going on in North and South Sudan. We can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things are all interlinked because the crisis itself is an interlinked crisis.
So let's get to justice. So you are not outspoken, but you speak up when you see injustice. Outspoken is not the right word, but you speak up when you see injustice, wherever it is, whoever is perpetrating it.
Yeah.
In our country, we're seeing things that we would never have imagined that we would have seen growing up.
Mm-hmm.
This is really an open discussion here. It's a heartbreaking moment, right? As I travel the world, and I was just in India, right? So, and my colleagues there are almost crying that this country that they looked up to as a bit of a beacon on a hill. It wasn't perfect. They understood that this country, our country, wasn't perfect, but the shooting of protesters in the street in Minnesota, the picking up of citizens, scared people, being demanded passports in the middle of the street, kind of, I call it gangster justice, right?
Yes.
So in the streets of our country, we're really in a moment that is frightening to many. As you work and write and work with communities on this issue, what are you hearing at the ground level?
Yeah. I mean, a few things. Of course, just this past weekend, we commemorated the assassination of one of the greatest people ever in U.S. and world history, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, right? Assassinated on February 21st. And, a lot of people don't know that El-Hajj Malik's last public essay was a critique of what is happening in Palestine to this day. It was called Zionist Logic. And, and he was bringing it all together. Malcolm also said, a very famous quote, if you think that we have to get it straightened out in Mississippi before we get it straightened out in the Congo, you're never going to get it straightened out in Mississippi. He was a Pan-Africanist. He was a friend of Che Guevara and a friend of Castro. When Castro came to New York City and many hotels would not give him a room, El-Hajj Malik got him, a room in Harlem. And, everybody knows the famous pictures that took place after that. So I think of him. We also lost last week a very famous civil rights leader in Jesse Jackson, a complicated life, but we cannot deny the impact that he had. Before we started recording, I was talking about his 1988 campaign, where he was able to go into white rural communities. And to this day, I've been in some of these white rural communities in Nebraska, where I work with farmers time to time. Pictures of Jesse still up, in their office. This impact that he had on people who probably don't vote for his party anymore for the most part, judging on the makeup of Nebraska anyway, and still had an impact on them. And so, and then I see, to the point where you were talking about with, people being asked for their papers, in the middle of the street, even podcasters like Joe Rogan taking umbrage, with that. Look at the interview that Tucker Carlson, of all people, just had with the ambassador to Israel for the United States, Mike Huckabee. I mean, Tucker Carlson dropping science. Alex Jones, talking about this is a genocide. This is wrong. Alex Jones, people, really.
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Marjorie Taylor Greene. I was just about to get to her. Come on. So I think that this is something that always happens when, as I like to say, white supremacy gets to Book of Revelation mode. It goes too far. where even people of conscience who you would never think would say the things that they are saying are like, no, 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 that is too much. That is what it took in the 1960s civil rights epoch. People like Mickey Schwerner and Andy Goodman, two Jewish white men who died in the same car as James Chaney in Philadelphia, Mississippi, of saying this has gone too far. So in that sense, what I'm hearing from people on the ground is enough, and we are willing to do whatever it takes to stop it. I probably like one of my favorites of the sort of like news with a little bit of jest is John Oliver. It can't be John Oliver killing it always.
He's
Right,
awesome.
He just came back to start his most recent season, and he's featuring like this regular looking white man in Minneapolis. It's night, it's freezing. I was up there, like, whoa, those people are built with something totally different, by the way.
They certainly are, yes.
Like, my goodness. And the way he was talking was like, F this and F that. These are my neighbors, and I have to go to work tomorrow, but I'm out here because I'm standing with them. And I think that is a beautiful thing that comes out of all of this madness and all of this melancholy, is this human element does get woken up, within people. Now, Martin Luther King and the great Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, had disagreements on this, right? Kwame would say, Martin, excuse me, has this interesting idea that if you let your oppressor beat you and beat you and beat you, at one point you will appeal to their conscience. Kwame said, this is a very interesting theory, but there's one flaw. It assumes that the oppressor has a conscience. And there is some truth to that, right? I don't know that there's any appealing to monsters like Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir. I don't think so. However, everyday people, right? What else have we been seeing more recently in Israel? 18-year-olds burning their orders to go and serve, right? And willing to go to prison as a result of it, because the everyday consciousness of everyday people is starting to emerge, right? I mean, and say like, this is not okay. And people taking to the streets in negative 15-degree weather or extremely hot weather. So that's one thing that I'm hearing. But the other thing I'm hearing, brother, is that people do not want to limit the solutions to elections alone. That they're saying elections, it's a good way to organize people. It's a good way for voices to be heard, but it's not going to be the sole pathway to collective liberation for poor and working class people of all races, all ethnicities, all gender identities. And this is something, as we are heading into this midterm election season, and just like every other midterm election, it's the most important one ever. Right? But,
the fate of society rests on this.
on this election that we're going to spend a bunch of money on.
Don't mess it up, voters.
So now you are hearing, I think, more of an approach to alternative systems. Mutual aid is in the lexicon in ways that, I mean, Minneapolis, man. I mean, when I was up there, these folk were raising 20 grand a week. And I was like, oh, are you getting this from national organizations? They were like, hell no, we're not. We don't want to get this from national organizations, because then they're going to tell us how we can and can't use the money. This is from everyday people sending 10, 15, 20, $25. But it's also the people that you don't see, and movements. Everybody thinks that the civil rights movement was, these charismatic leaders like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and John Lewis, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and they are amazing people. I'm not, no shade at all. But Ella Baker, who's probably one of the best organizers of all time, she would say the most important people in the civil rights are the people you never saw, the people who cooked for people, the people who gave rides to people, the people who did free childcare, the people who did free medical care and things like that. You're starting to see that more, and that's it. That's a very, very beautiful thing that I think that in your mind the light ethos that we can keep building off of, because it really is, as Audre Lorde and Assata Shakur, who also lost, at the end of last year, said, if we're not organizing for alternative systems, what is it that we're doing? I think that more people are coming to the conclusion that it's not just who's in control of the system at any given time for 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 years. It's the system itself that needs some serious, transformation if we're going to not just emancipate ourselves from a climate crisis, if we're not going to emancipate people from genocide and imperialism and international gangsterism that we're seeing our nation take part in, right? Sending armadas, basically an effective blockade of Cuba, an effective blockade of Venezuela, an effective military armada now threatening the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of just like, we don't want, to do this. War has not seemed to be able to navigate the very tense situation between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. How long has it been now? I mean, years. And it doesn't seem to be getting to any closer conclusion of peace. And so I think that I'm especially the young people, they're not waiting, to be handed some proverbial baton or torch and said, okay, now you can lead. We're not waiting. We're not asking for permission. So to see that valor, like, a lot of people don't like to talk about what we were seeing on college campuses when Biden was in power. Students, daughters, your children, your daughter's age, getting beaten for standing up for human rights, right? A Zionist mob at UCLA, still no investigation, and throwing chemical agents into a group of students in their encampment, and the students said, we're going to keep going, of course, it hasn't been as direct and profound as we saw previously, and there's obvious reasons for that. We, first and foremost, young people, we want you to go to college and learn and have the best 4 years of your life and remember as much of those 4 years as you can, right? For whatever reason, that's what we want first and foremost. But these students are saying that's not possible for us to have a normal life when so much is not normal, and we're not going to accept this as normal. So that was a lot, but I mean, that is the beautiful thing that we're seeing is really we're people not necessarily accepting it, and also pushing for more than just flipping a congressional seat or 10 or 15 or whatever. They want to see a lot more, and they're saying if the government won't do it, we will do it. We will create our own autonomous systems, as we saw in Minneapolis, as we saw in Los Angeles, and as we're seeing in more cities across the country, not just with respect to the ICE situation, but look at what we've seen. ICE pulled back. They realized, Trump realized we messed with the wrong city. And something that, Minneapolites, I think that's what they call themselves. Who knows?
Minneapolis.
I mean, no one cares. They don't have any sports
Too many
teams.
syllables.
Yeah, they don't have any good sports teams, so we don't care, Kareem. But they said, please go back and let your people know that this was not spontaneous. This is the result of decades of organizing and community infrastructure. And that is what's going to be necessary if you want to see these types of responses, they said, not reactions, responses to massive injustice, to the point where Tom Homan had to basically say, we are withdrawing because, we can't have this. I don't know, Kareem, honestly, that we have seen something like that since Dr. King was in Birmingham, where it was all of what he called it Plan C, the confrontational, nonviolent direct action that forced the individual businesses to end segregation before the government did. And like basically a retreat from a set of policies that were inhumane, unjust, and flat out wrong. And the people basically saying, we can do this all day. We are not going to stop until you stop. And when you stop, we are still going to, and if you ever think about coming back again, we'll be ready, whether it's the winter, the summer, the fall, or the spring. And that is something that should carry us, for a while, because it goes to show that people still maintain their humanity in the face of massive, massive oppression. Like you said, that you and I didn't think we were going to see. Our parents dealt with that, man.
I think this, what you said, right? So the humanity of it and people coming together to take care of each other,
yes,
is what gives me hope, right? So we asked on climate justice, what gives you hope? On this is what gives me hope, right? It's communities taking care of each other, bringing food, medical attention to those who are scared to leave their homes, right? So these are people who have contributed to communities, raising up solid connective tissue within their
Yes.
communities. And we've seen that in Minnesota and other places around the country where people are taking care of each other, in the face of basically unimaginable oppression that
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
have not seen, I would say, in our life. Like in the time that we've been alive, you're
Yeah. I mean,
probably 49,
we've
I'm
seen some things.
50. We haven't seen
Right.
it.
Right. We've seen some things, right? We here we go. I'm aging us right now. We were alive for Rodney King, that and that was like, we were alive for the first Gulf War, which, I remember for us, we were really, really scared. And it turns out that
We
was
were
a pretty,
scared.
pretty, it was
Yes.
pretty light compared to the second Gulf War. We of course were alive for George Floyd. But you're right. I mean, like maybe in '99 there was the battle for Seattle when WTO was in Seattle and things got pretty tense, but nothing like that from our governments. And I think that the other beautiful thing that is hopeful is you are in this blessed holy month of Ramadan. It is a month of introspection, as well. And I think people are asking themselves, what have we taken for granted? As the great Angela Davis reminds us in her book about Ferguson, Missouri, and we, of course, were alive for Mike Brown and things like that. Freedom is a constant struggle from Ferguson to Palestine. Freedom is a constant struggle. And really the message in that book is like, you can't, take it for granted. She likes to say that, being a resident of the United States is advanced citizenship. Like you got to want it, or someone else who wants their vision of America that has nothing to do with what you and I and people of conscience would ever, say agree with. They're going to take it. They're going to take it. So you can't take it for granted, and we can't get too comfortable, because the moment that we do that, we will become even more uncomfortable, as we just witnessed. So yeah, it gives me hope too. We still have some work to do in climate spaces, right? There's still a lot of complacency in U.S. climate spaces. This is traditionally a guild of very affluent, mostly white people who have never had to deal with watching a relative die slowly because they've been afflicted with cancer or asthma, and have never really gone without wanting as it pertains to putting food on the table. So, but you're seeing more and more of those interventions in climate spaces with people who look like me, young people. It was young indigenous people that started the Standing Rock uprising, for
Right.
instance. So, we're seeing it. But I think that a lot of people have been inspired by what we've seen in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and other cities, even Philly, right? I mean, Philly really is a city of brotherly love, despite how rude your fans are. It's a city of brotherly love. And having spent a lot of time in Philly, you come into Philly neighborhoods talking mess. Look at your DA, Mr. Larry Krasner, who was saying, FAFO, if you break the law, ICE in my city, I'm going to hold you accountable. Look at my face and come test me. And that's a beautiful
And
thing.
they haven't come to test him yet. So not saying it won't happen, but
same thing in my hometown, where another beautiful thing that happened, of course, is the election of Zoran Mamdani, right? 34-year-old Muslim brothers. He's celebrating Ramadan right now while going through a massive snowstorm. Of course, immigrant, Ugandan Indian brother, democratic socialist, in the artery of global capitalism, showed what is possible when everyday people come together to take on big money and big establishment, whether it was in his own party or otherwise. 100,000 volunteers.
With Mamdani, right? So his campaign was brilliant in that they always stayed on message, right?
Yes.
What country are you going to go to visit? I don't need to go visit anywhere because I'm elected by the city of New York, and
yes.
I'm here to fix affordability. And he was very just disciplined in his message. He always stayed on point. Yes. And he's staying on point now, right? So
third day in office, Kareem, this brother gets universal child care. Third day. Okay. I mean, and even
He can
during the
get hard
debates,
things done, right? So, I mean,
he's
I
getting
think
things done.
the proof of Mamdani over his term will be that I do believe that he can get things done because he's going to challenge the system. He's not going to
Yes.
accept no for an answer,
Yes.
and he's going to listen, right? So he's going to listen to to his opponents and to people who are challenging him to
Yes.
what they need in order to get things done.
Well,
And he's going
look
to
what
find common ground in order to get that done.
one of the things that
So
he's doing, he's essentially doing a tribunal in all 5 boroughs for bad landlords, right? Going on a listening session to hear from people for bad landlords. And you know, he's not perfect. I had the chance of interviewing him right before for the election. And, you know, it was really hard to interview him, Kareem, because I was so enamored. I'm trying to like be professional, but I'm like, holy S, this guy actually is telling the truth, man. I actually like believe what this man is saying, and you know, we saw it during the debates. You know, I mean, he's a real New Yorker. You know, even when there's like a question of it's Game 7 of the Yankees and the Knicks, which one are you going to go to? And Cuomo goes, "I'll split my time. I'll go half the Yankees." And Zoran's like, "Come on, man, Knicks." Obviously, he's like, "You see, this is what I'm talking about. You know, indecisiveness. Everybody knows if there's a Game 7 for the Knicks, we're going to see the Knicks, right?" He can relate to people young and old, and that victory speech, you know, was everybody felt it. I am not stepping down. I am a proud Muslim. I'm a proud immigrant. I'm a proud democratic socialist. And he said to Trump, he was like, "Come and try us. You will have to get through all of us." New York City, a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, and as of tonight, a city run by an immigrant. And you that.
thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, brother. We could have harnessed the energy of the crowd when he said
But
that. So yeah,
I'll say, you know, sort of to wrap up here. I mean, I think the Mamdani experience, I think, has it's done something for me, right? It's proved that a nice guy can win because he
yep,
truly is a nice guy,
sweet
right?
man,
So,
sweet man, good sense
like,
of humor and everything.
what you see is what he is, and you know, he's not ashamed of it, and he lives it very proudly. And he sticks to his values, right? So a nice guy who sticks to their values in the 8th largest economy in the world, right? So
Yes,
with a budget of like $118 billion, um, and he's delivering on his promise. It's only a couple
that's
months,
right.
but you know, we'll see
Well,
how he goes
there's
along. But
superstructure,
he's
Kareem, to keep him hold him accountable, right? I mean, you know, the DSA. I mean, look, you're talking about all of this and everything. You're right. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say this real quick.
please.
2 things where I saw this guy's humanity. He's announcing the universal child care, and this cute little kid, you know, like tugs on him during the press conference, and she's like, "When are you gonna have a baby?" You know, and he just starts laughing, and he looks at her. He's like, "How much did my parents like pay you to ask me that question?" You know what I mean? Like, so there's that. But it was a recent appointment that he made for his new head of the Department of Corrections, and he selected a person who was a former inmate on the infamous and ignominious Rikers Island. And when he's introducing the gentleman, he says something, and again, not a dry eye in the house. He looks at the brother and he said, "When I met you a year ago, I told you that your story isn't over, and today we affirm that." I mean, we're supposed to be tough New Yorkers, you know, and everybody's like,
And everybody's and you know, the Mamdani always holds his heart, right? So
yes,
that like
yes,
it
yes,
warmed
yes,
me
yes, yes.
as you said that. Well, Anthony, you know, your human centric listening persona as you go around the world and work on these issues. Keep doing that, Anthony, please.
Of course, brother. Yes.
And this episode of The Pioneers of Possibility has been produced and edited by Danny Vagnoni, with music credits going to the artist known as Sahari. And artwork for our podcast is presented by the artist known as Layla. I'm your host, Kareem Afzal. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode and you would like to hear more from future episodes, please follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and click the subscribe button on YouTube. And please leave a comment so we can engage our listeners. Thank you very much. See you next time.